Hi guys, welcome to my vlog. So, we are looking at cell respiration. Now, the first little part of this topic is going to be about ATP and an introduction into respiration. So, let's get started. So with ATP, these are the main things that we want to answer. What is it made up of? How does it form? How is it broken down? Why is it so suitable as an energy source? And what is it used for? So we've been hearing so much about ATP throughout AS and A2, but ATP, what are you? So this is ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. So this bit basically means that there are three phosphates combined with a ribose sugar and adenine, which was a nitrogenous base. Now, ribose we've heard before because it was the sugar found in RNA, and adenine we've heard before because it was one of the nitrogenous bases found in DNA and RNA. So here we are with our little molecule of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, what's actually pretty important about ATP is this little phosphate at the end. This little phosphate can either join or be removed, and because of that, we actually have two other forms of adenine joined with ribose. So if we have the adenine, the ribose, and one phosphate, it's called adenosine monophosphate. That's actually quite rare, and we're not really going to talk about it at all in this topic. And we've also got adenosine diphosphate, which we actually do talk about quite a lot. And that's because the ATP that gets made in respiration actually also gets broken down to form ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. And through that process, a little bit of energy is released, which can be used for different things within cells. So the next part then is how is ATP formed? Well, ATP formed is formed in this way. So it forms when a phosphate molecule joins with an ADP molecule in a condensation reaction. Now remember, condensation reaction means that water is removed from molecules. This is known as phosphorylation, which is the addition of a phosphate molecule to another molecule. So in this case, we are phosphorylating an ADP molecule to make ATP. Then, the whole point of this is that it makes the molecule more energy rich or more reactive. So when we look later on, we're going to see that actually glucose doesn't really release energy itself in respiration. Instead, what it does is it gets broken down, and in lots of different steps, it releases enough energy to create ATP, and the ATP can then be used to provide energy for different processes. ATP is then broken up in this way. So it requires the enzyme ATPase, which is not very imaginative at all, but ATPase breaks it down in a hydrolysis reaction, which is basically adding water and cutting it, which you might remember from last year. So the hydro was to do with water and lysis was to do with cutting. So you basically add in, or this enzyme adds in a water molecule between the second and third inorganic phosphate molecule, and that splits up the ATP into two parts, ADP and phosphate. So ATP gets broken up by ATPase, and it happens when the third phosphate molecule is removed, and when it's broken down, it releases energy. So by breaking up this ATP, that's the process that releases energy. Now, just to summarize that, so if we start with ADP plus a phosphate, what can happen is we can combine those to form ATP. That takes place in a condensation reaction. So what has to happen is we have to remove water. But then once we've got the ATP, so in other words, once the ADP has been phosphorylated, we get ATP, and it can be broken down in a hydrolysis reaction, which adds water. And when that happens, it also releases energy. So the next part then is, why is ATP useful as an immediate energy source? Well, there's three main reasons. Firstly, hydrolysis, which is the breakdown of ATP, releases a small amount of energy compared to glucose, so the energy can be released in small, manageable steps. We're going to see that if you want to break down glucose to release energy, it actually takes loads of different steps. So hydrolysis of ATP is just one simple step, breaking down one single bond. Hydrolysis of ATP is also a single step reaction, so this provides the cell with fine control over its immediate energy budget. So this basically means, because ATP is only really broken down when it's needed, it allows the cell to control what it expends energy on, hence the term its energy budget. ATP is a small soluble molecule, which means it can be easily transported from the mitochondria, which is where it is synthesized, to any part of the cell. Now, we're going to look at all the different processes that involve ATP. So this last step basically means that because ATP is so small and it's soluble, it can be easily transported from the mitochondria to anywhere it is needed. So here's all the different processes that require ATP. Active transport, which was basically whenever we were talking about moving substances from a low concentration to a high concentration, or in other words, against the concentration gradient. So active transport provides energy for that, and it also provides energy for the membrane proteins that transport substances against the concentration gradient. Cytosis, which was the formation of vesicles during exo and endocytosis, so whenever substances move in or out of the cell. Synthesis reactions, so ATP was required to make peptide bonds between amino acids, and it was also used in starch, lipid and fat synthesis. Resynthesis reactions, so in the nervous system we looked at how acetylcholine was broken down and then it was resynthesized in the presynaptic bulb or presynaptic knob, and how rhodopsin was also resynthesized in rod cells. Then for muscle contraction, cell division, heat production, and just other things that we've looked at. So for example, translocation in the phloem, which was the movement of sugars, and the movement of cilia. So as you can see, ATP is required an awful lot in different organisms. And that's because a lot of processes in different organisms will take place at the cellular level, and ATP is basically the energy source at a cellular level. Even something as large as muscle contraction, which can move a whole part of an organism's body, still requires ATP at the actual muscle cells, at the cellular level. And that's basically our little intro with ATP complete. Now the next part is basically looking at breaking down the big lie that was respiration at GCSE. So we said that it takes place in all cells, which is still correct. It does. It takes place in the mitochondria, which still does. And we said that this was the equation where we start with oxygen, it reacts with glucose to produce carbon dioxide plus water. Now, strictly speaking, there's a lot more to it than this. It's not just as neat and tidy as that. Actually, what it's like is we start with a glucose, we break it down, and along the way there's some carbon dioxide released. There's also some ATP. As well as that, what's more likely to happen is there's going to be loads and loads of hydrogens given off, and it's those hydrogens which actually go a long way to producing a lot of the ATP that we've been talking about in the first little part. And then basically right at the very end we have little oxygens coming along, joining up to forming water. So we pretty much start with glucose. There's about a bazillion steps. There's even a little cycle in here and a little electron transport chain. there's loads of hydrogen released and we get loads of ATP produced. And then at the very, very end, that's where oxygen comes in. So even though we talk about how important oxygen is for respiration, it's not actually used until the very, very end, and water isn't produced until the very, very end either. So let's have a look at the main steps that are going to take place here. So here's the main steps for respiration. So we've got the substrates, the stages of respiration, and then the products of. So as we know, we start off with glucose and oxygen. Glucose is used at the very start, oxygen's at the very end. So glucose goes into this process known as glycolysis, and then we get pyruvate formed. As well as that, we get some energy released. Now it's energy in the form of ATP. And then pyruvate goes into a little short reaction known as a link reaction. It's basically called a link reaction because it links up glycolysis with the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is a little process which releases carbon dioxide, but it also produces loads and loads of hydrogen atoms. Now those hydrogen atoms then go into a little process known as the electron transport chain, where they get passed along from different electron carriers, and then we get the hydrogen atoms released again, only they've given up some of their energy, which has been used to produce ATP. And then the hydrogen atoms, instead of just floating about in the cell, the oxygen comes along, picks them up, and produces water. And that's the process of respiration, which is definitely not as neat and tidy as that little equation was. But the 4 steps that we're going to look at is glycolysis, link reaction, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Now, the next wee video is going to start to look at those. Who knows if they're going to be all together, or who knows if they're going to be split up? We just haven't decided yet. But come along with me for a fun journey.